Dracula. The very name is synonymous with terror.
You feel you know that there's menace coming, and he's never going to die.
The creation of Irish author Bram Stoker, this iconic tale of a medieval vampire stalking the streets of London, has scared and inspired millions around the world for over 120 years.
Dracula is the first time that evil gets to be attractive, and evil gets his name on the cover.
Since its first publication in 1897, Bram Stoker's novel has never been out of print.
It's partly an adventure story involving, good, strong men. They take on the forces of the undead.
I've been dying to meet you.
I'll be traveling the world in search of the vampire's origins and speaking to some of the people who have, over the years, given Dracula fresh blood.
I just wanted the surprise of seeing him as Dracula, and boy, did I get a surprise.
Dracula is not only an icon of horror, but of our culture.
Stake through the heart. You see, sometimes the legends are right.
Dracula is so iconic, he's got his own emoji.
Appropriately enough, he just won't stay dead. But what is it about the character that has so permeated the popular imagination? Why does Dracula keep on rising from the grave?
I am Dracula.
Cut, lovely. Right.
As myself and Stephen Moffat present our new version of the story, I want to discover what is at the heart of the legend. In all his guises, from book to stage to film, this is the story of Dracula's creation and his immortal afterlife.
With some of the versions one's seen and pictures certainly I've seen, you're just sucked in.
Why do we keep on returning to the Count? To what extent has public taste changed our perception of the vampire? And what is the secret of his hypnotic hold over us all?
This is my search for Dracula.
Bram Stoker's novel begins with an English solicitor, Jonathan Harker, heading across Europe for an appointment with his mysterious client, Count Dracula. Like Harker, I'm traveling east, but to Orava in Slovakia.
When I was a child, I was obsessed with horror films. They were on TV on a Friday night after the sports report, or in occasional Saturday night double bills. A black and white universal chiller followed by the Eastman colour glories of a Hammer movie. I couldn't get enough of them, and actors like Vincent Price, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee were my heroes. And although I ate, slept and drank zombies, werewolves and Frankensteins, I always had a soft spot for Dracula. We used to have a big red velvet curtain tucked away in the ottoman, and I would get it out, pretend it was my cloak, and restage Christopher Lee's death agonies from Dracula Has Risen from the Grave.
Jutting like a fang above the village of Orava looms Castle Orava. We've chosen this as the location for our new version of Dracula, but its ancient walls have played host to the undead Count before.
This location holds a special place in the hearts of Dracula fans. It was here in 1921 that F.W. Murnau made Nosferatu, a symphony of terror. It was probably the first Dracula adaptation, albeit an unofficial one, and introduced the world to the unforgettable Max Schreck as Count Orlok, a grotesque, bald-headed, taloned nightmare, whose image became indelibly associated with the vampire.
The look of Nosferatu was the fevered brainchild of Albin Grau, a very strange man who oversaw the film's entire design, from sets to makeup. Nosferatu is packed with genuine occult imagery and even calligraphy. Everything about this film is wonderfully weird. This rodent-fanged monstrosity is one of the most familiar representations of Dracula on screen, and its talons have extended far beyond its origins. Count Orlok's shocking visage has lost none of its impact and has been resurrected with startling effect ever since. But how was actor Max Schreck transformed into the gruesome Count Orlok nearly 100 years ago?
And there was nothing...
I'm joining prosthetics team Dave and Lou Elsey, who created the look for our Dracula, to find out why this image has left such a lasting impression.
Yeah. This makeup, for some reason, it's just perfection. You know, you can tell it's perfection because people can't get over it. People are still doing it today. And Nosferatu is just a terrifying nightmare creature. There's nothing human about him at all, you know, and the makeup is very broad as well. It's very theatrical. It's like something that you would do for a stage play. That's it. Yeah.
Simply the weekend, sir.
Although clearly meant to be Bram Stoker's Count, Max Schreck's walking corpse bears little resemblance to the sophisticated, suave aristocrat that we today identify as Dracula. But the film did introduce some aspects of vampire lore which became fixed. Although his powers are slightly weakened by its rays, in the novel, Dracula is perfectly capable of walking around in daylight. It was Nosferatu and its famous climax which created the idea that the vampire could be destroyed by sunlight.
Nosferatu is quite rightly regarded today as one of the classics of silent cinema, but it only survived by the skin of its strangely sharp teeth. An entirely illegitimate production, it was ordered to be destroyed by Bram Stoker's widow, Florence, after she sued the producers over breach of copyright. Thankfully, a few prints survived, so we can still enjoy Nosferatu today in all its weird glory.
As many were to discover over the subsequent years, the Count proved very difficult to kill. But where did this imperishable icon come from? Whose morbid imagination actually conceived Dracula? Born, raised and educated in Dublin, Abraham Bram Stoker began his career in the Irish civil service. But it was his passionate interest in the dramatic arts that led to unpaid work as a theatre critic for the Dublin Evening Mail. In December 1876, following a performance of Hamlet he attended, Stoker began a 28-year association with the most dominant, in every sense of the word, personality of his life, the legendary actor Sir Henry Irving.
Bram Stoker was invited by Henry Irving to come over as his business manager and assistant. And dropping everything in Dublin, that's exactly what he does. He moves over and works for Irving for 28 years. Stoker hero-worshipped Irving. Irving exploited that. And Irving would say, Bram, Bram, I say, come here. You know, he absolutely depended on his servitor to do things for him. One of his obituaries says, I have never known in my life the absorption of one man in another man's life as much as Stoker was absorbed in Irving's life. There was something almost umbilical about their relationship. I think Dracula is partly based on Irving's performances. Irving loved big supernatural parts where he could really, you know, with a strong slice of jambon attached.
But there are other theories as to the Count's origin. It was later claimed that it was a nightmare endured by Stoker after a meal of dressed crab that first inspired his creation. A ghastly vision that included 3 female vampire brides descending on their victim and their satanic master intoning, "This man belongs to me."
I believe it to have been the nightmare that kick-started the whole of Dracula, where you have the three vampire brides coming up and he doesn't know whether he's asleep or not, and it's interrupted by the Count. The Count comes in and says, "This man belongs to me, I want him." And Stoker writes that down in March 1890. He writes it down again in 1892. He writes it down again, and everything else changes in Dracula. But the one thing that remains consistent is, "This man belongs to me, I want him."
What do you think Dracula's about?
It's partly about dominance and dependence, sexual relationships. It's partly an adventure story involving, good, strong men, the forces of light. Using folklore, religion, and science, they take on the forces of the undead. But it's turned into myth, so you can pour into it what you like.
Stoker had already written several books, frantically scrambled together during his punishing work hours, and spent 6 years making notes for his next. This book would be of an altogether different order. Whilst vampires had existed in folklore for centuries, it was Stoker who pulled these references together to create an immortal myth.
In 2018, the London Library's Director of Development, Philip Spedding, concluded a treasure hunt which sheds a fascinating light on the wider inspirations behind Stoker's novel. In these dusty volumes lie the facts and figures, the myths and legends which gave birth to Dracula. How did this treasure hunt of yours begin?
I was intrigued by how Bram Stoker might have used the library. We knew he had joined the library in 1890, and we know that that's when he started his research on Dracula. And I went into the shelves, and the first book I pulled out was this, The Book of Werewolves, by a man called Sabine Baring Gould. I started to go through this book and compare it to the notes that Stoker had taken, and saw there was a remarkable correlation between some of the marks in this book and some of the notes that Stoker had taken. And in the end, it turned out we had almost all the books that Stoker said that he had been interested in when undertaking his research. Round About the Carpathians by Andrew Cross, 1878, borrowed by Stoker. In here, Cross is talking about a journey through Hungarian towns and says, "The houses are mostly of one story, standing each one alone, with a gable end blank and windowless towards the road." And then if you look at the story of Dracula, when Harker is going towards Castle Dracula, he describes the villages he is going through with their blank gable end towards the road. So there's an exact line that Stoker picked up from a book and put into the final novel. And then, of course, there's one other book that Stoker looked at. Now, his record suggests that he borrowed this in Whitby, but this is the book, an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia from 1820. And in his notes, he talks about seeing the word Dracula in this book. And our copy, entertainingly, has the page on which the word Dracula appears. The corner has been turned down, tantalizingly.
What you really want, of course, is a big sort of 3 exclamation marks, maybe a smiley face.
Yes, must use this in my novel. This is marvelous
Smiley
stuff.
face with fangs.
Yes.
Yes. So that's the first part of the paper trail, the trail that leads to Dracula. But the next stop on our treasure hunt is, somewhat unexpectedly, Philadelphia. My travels have brought me here to the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, USA, which since 1970 has been the home to a collection which provides a fascinating insight into Bram Stoker's working methods.
Housed here is a precious first edition of the completed novel from 1897. But most excitingly, I've been given permission to explore the handwritten research notes and workings which together show the novel coming to life in Stoker's mind.
Well, here we are. It's a privilege and a thrill to be here amongst these sacred relics, as it were. These scribbled fragments, which begin in 1890 and stretch, I think, over a 6-year period, represent the unused characters, blind alleys, and eureka moments, which together constitute Dracula. So on this page, which is dated the 14th of March, 1890, Stoker has divided his proposed novel into 4 books. The first one is book 1, headed Styria, which is the original location. And then it's been crossed out, as you can see here, and replaced with Transylvania. Transylvania to London. And this section contains reference to lawyers' letters, wolves arrive at the castle, loneliness, the kiss, and in quotes, "This man belongs to me," which appears to have been one of Stoker's first thoughts about this, possibly from that nightmare. This is where Stoker delineates the rules of the beast. And here on the first page we have no looking glass in Count's house, never can see him reflected in one, no shadow, question mark. Lights arranged to give no shadow. Never eats nor drinks, certainly went with that one. Enormous strength, see in the dark, power of getting small or large. That's intriguing. This is a delightful detail. Painters cannot paint him. Their likenesses always look like someone else. I think that's a beautiful idea. It's a shame that's not followed up, actually. And there's a wonderful section later where an unused idea that the Count can't be photographed or Kodaked, to actually coin a verb, because of the same reason that he's not really properly corporeal. But most fantastically, Count Vampire, as he is called, this is the moment, it seems, where Stoker has the revelation, seemingly inspired by the book he took out of the Whitby Library to call him Dracula. And here we can see, you can almost see the working process of Stoker's mind here. He writes down the top left, Dracula, top right, Dracula, and then the top left-hand corner, definitively and underlined, Count Dracula. Maybe this is the moment where it actually happened. I mean, obviously, he had no conception it was going to be a name that lived throughout history. So here it is, culmination of 7 years of musing and scribbling and stewing and thinking. This is the first edition of Dracula, bound in this very distinctive fin de siècle yellow cloth, which must have given it a certain frisson to people of the late 19th century who associated anything yellow with things slightly outre and diabolical and naughty, which indeed is what this very weird book actually is. Amazing to actually see it here. And of course, Stoker had no idea of the legacy which this novel was going to have and the absolutely imperishable brand which the name of Dracula was going to become.
The book was finally published on May 26, 1897, and quickly gained critical success. Much was made of Stoker's clever trick of bringing a medieval monster into modern London. But Stoker had been keen to extend the reach of his story, and 8 days prior to the novel's release, the Count had already taken on another form.
On the morning of May the 18th, 1897, the first theatrical performance of Dracula, or the Undead, took place at London's Lyceum Theatre to a paying audience of just 2 people. Performed by the Lyceum's company of actors, minus Sir Henry Irving, the reading had been arranged specifically by Stoker to protect the dramatic rights to his new novel. He had hastily cut and pasted together a script from the galley proofs of the book. The result was not a success.
Dracula, or the Undead. Prologue. Scene 1. Outside Castle Dracula. Hi. Where are you off to? Gone already? Well, this is a pretty nice state of things. After a drive through solid darkness with an unknown man whose face I've not seen, and who has in his hand the strength of 20 men, and who could drive back a pack of wolves by holding up his hand.
It took 4 interminable hours. Henry Irving had only one devastating comment: dreadful. It was to be the only official stage version of Dracula during Bram Stoker's lifetime.
In 1924, 12 years after Stoker's death and 2 years after the first screening of Nosferatu, impresario Hamilton Dean secured the theatrical rights to the story. His much reimagined stage adaptation would come to define the image of Count Dracula.
Dean had one major problem with adapting it, and that was Dracula himself. What do you do with a character who's off stage the whole time? He had to be completely, we can use the word revamped, you know, as the kind of character that you could bring into polite society. You could entertain in a drawing room, and it meant dumping most of the book, you know, which has this great, geographical sweep and scope. But of course, the character of Dracula was completely transformed. He was now a suave, sinister, ingratiating character who burrowed his way into your life and wouldn't let go.
So really, the popular image of Dracula is much more from the play than from the novel, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You can ask anybody who is Dracula? What does Dracula look like? How does Dracula talk? How does Dracula dress? It's all from the stage play.
The popularity of the play caught the eye of American producers, and a revised version successfully ran on Broadway. Crucially, this new vision of Dracula, complete with stand-up collar, white tie and cape, was embodied by the little-known Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi.
He was considered to be perfect for the role of Dracula. And Horace Liveright, the producer, and John Balderston, who adapted Dean's play for Broadway, all saw this strange magnetic quality about him. And it had to do with the fact that he didn't speak English very well. That very deliberate manner of speaking. There's a scene where Dracula disappears down through a trapdoor, and then
a vampire trap.
Yes, it was called a vampire trap, and the other actors were left holding his empty cape, and a flash bomb went off. And to accomplish this, the cape had to have a collar that could almost completely hide his head. In fact, there was a little hood on a frame that represented the top of his head, because the actor was actually going down through a trapdoor at this climactic moment. So it serves no real function other than that, but it became a signature feature of vampire costuming for all time.
I love that. It's like a sort of little fossil, which has now lost all its original meaning, but it has to be. Somehow it's part of the look.
2 years after the successful Broadway play, Universal Pictures produced the first official version of Dracula on film, with sound. But it was by no means a foregone conclusion that Bela Lugosi would repeat his Broadway performance on the big screen. Many other actors, including Conrad Veidt and Paul Mooney, were considered as far more of a box office draw than the unknown Hungarian.
Bela Lugosi had been lobbying for it and making it known that he would work for very small money in Hollywood terms to have the part. And in the end, he made such an indelible impression with that part. The strange voice, the magnetic presence. He had one of the most intense, stares that anybody ever had on screen.
I am Dracula. I bid you welcome.
Universal's film was a smash hit, and its legacy is undeniable. But it's hard to see from this distance why it made such an impact. The pace is funereal, the direction leaden. Lugosi is hard to take seriously. It's one of the great what-ifs of cinema history. If only somebody else with real drive and vision had been shooting Dracula on those spectacular sets. Well, as a matter of fact, they were.
In the early days of the talkies, hearing actors speaking in their natural voices was a profitable novelty. As a result, and to serve overseas markets, many studios began simultaneously producing foreign language versions of the same films. In the Spanish language version of Dracula, Carlos Villarius wore the cape and reputedly even the same toupee as Bela Lugosi, and the film used the same sets and costumes as its English counterpart. Working like vampires through the night, this second team succeeded in creating a strikingly different version.
Soy Dracula.
Although some of the long shots were of Bela Lugosi himself, taken from unused rushes, the Spanish Dracula is a wonderful work in its own right. Stylish, creepy and bold, it's that rare thing. Not just a what if, but a there it is. In my opinion, infinitely superior to the Lugosi version.
Compare this scene where the vampire brides attempt to feed on their unwilling victim. In the Lugosi film, a slow, stately entrance seen from behind, then foiled by a stagey Dracula. In the Spanish version, a lustrous, alarming close-up. Then the brides move in for their feast. Despite the film's appeal, there was to be no direct sequel for Bela Lugosi's Count. Gloria Holden appeared as Dracula's daughter, a curious film now best remembered for its startlingly frank lesbian seduction scene. And Lon Chaney Jr., as a rather solid vampire, brought a certain doughy menace to the steamy, Deep South set, Son of Dracula. John Carradine then made 2 brief appearances as Dracula, complete with jaunty top hat.
Bela Lugosi was a far more versatile actor than he's ever given credit for. He's absolutely wonderful, for instance, in Son of Frankenstein, as the broken-necked Igor. But it was Dracula who forever stalked him. His last appearance in the familiar white tie and tails was in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, a fate that not even the Prince of Darkness himself could survive. Although I absolutely love it.
Forever typecast, Lugosi returned as the vampire, but his new version of the Count was now sharing the screen with the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster, and the Invisible Man, like some Gothic Avengers Assemble. After this, the Count languished somewhat, barring such curios as this 1953 Turkish adaptation, Dracula in Istanbul. The film is most notable today for introducing for the first time the fangs we have come to associate with those of the vampire.
By the late 1950s, in the shadow of the atom bomb, Gothic horror was somewhat in abeyance. But thanks to the efforts of one small British film studio, here near Windsor, Count Dracula was about to return home and stage a magnificent resurrection.
Established in 1951, Bray Studios became the home of Hammer Films. World famous for their Gothic chillers, they redefined the horror genre for a new generation. Although closed for a short period, 65 years on, Bray Studios is alive again, and by a wonderful coincidence, is playing home to the studio filming of our new Dracula series. It was here in 1958 that Christopher Lee made the first of 7 Hammer appearances in the role, giving his Dracula an unforgettable entrance.
Mr. Harker, I'm glad that you've arrived safely.
Count Dracula.
I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house.
So here we are, Jonathan, Bray Studios on the lovely Thames.
I'm meeting up with film historian Jonathan Rigby, who can tell me more about this marvellous building's gruesome legacy. It was within these walls that Victor Frankenstein carried out his horrific experiments, and the mummy wreaked havoc after making his escape from his Egyptian sarcophagus.
Inside the tomb.
Very tomb-like atmosphere at the moment, yeah.
So what was done in here, Jonathan?
Well, this particular space was colloquially known as the ballroom stage, properly known as Stage 3, and because of its rectangular formation, it was where they tended to put their pubs and inns. So this space was used for the inn in Dracula, where Cushing's Van Helsing gets a very frosty reception from the landlord, who of course was George Woodbury. Who else?
Good day, sir.
Good day.
It was in this studio that Peter Cushing made his on-screen debut as Dracula's implacable enemy, Dr. Van Helsing.
May I have a brandy, please?
Certainly, sir.
Audiences proved more receptive than these Transylvanian locals, and Hammer's horror formula became box office gold.
Dracula was made by essentially the same team that had just made The Curse of Frankenstein, and The Curse of Frankenstein had been out for maybe 5 months or so when they got round to Dracula, and of course it had been a huge hit, so they were on a head of steam, you know, they were on the crest of a wave, they were infused with massive confidence, you know, we're onto something here. James Carreras, who ran Hammer Films, said, you know, they've got this great formula for horror. What you do with your monster is you make him the handsome guy or the pretty girl that you might see on the underground any day, you know, and you think you'd be safe with him, whatever happened, but, you know, when you get home with him, blam, I think that's what Carreras said, blam, he does terrible, ghastly, awful things. They made him a rather chilly, but very sexy post-war man. They made him much younger. Lee was 35 at the time that he first played Dracula. I think he was very conscious, as were Hammer, of the fact that they could step up the sexual content.
The Byronically handsome Lee completely reinvented the popular perception of Dracula. Gone with the stagey theatrics of Lugosi, in their place, a sexy, unstoppable, upright shark, the terrible lover who died yet lived. And all in Hammer's glorious colour.
Lee was aware that this was a huge opportunity and that he should grab it with both hands, and he certainly did.
And then an odd echo of Lugosi, and then he's not asked back. There is a quick sequel, The Brides of Dracula, first horror film I ever saw and one of my absolute favourites.
Oh, yes.
And Peter Cushing returns, it's a Van Helsing sequel.
In The Brides of Dracula, Van Helsing's enemy is the distinctly fey but oddly disturbing Baron Meinster. But the absence of Christopher Lee is felt. I want to find out what it was he brought to the part of Dracula, and I know just the people who can tell me.
This is Oakley Court, now a hotel, once the exterior of Castle Meinster from The Brides of Dracula. What better place to be reunited with some old friends?
Do you have to look inside the sandwich?
No, that's a cucumber.
Now stop talking about cucumbers.
Oh, sorry.
Tell me about Dracula.
Okay.
Everyone talk at once.
Okay. Were you thrilled to be asked to do it? I was thrilled.
I was delighted.
So long as we could have fangs, I'd sometimes leave the studio with the bite marks in my neck and a few people in cars.
Christopher did say, this is the most difficult acting that you could ever do.
He used to sing. Do you remember he sang?
Yes.
Oh, yes. He used to sing under my door. And I go, oh, it's a lovely sound here, my dear. Can you hear that?
Yes.
I got bored with the opera because he was in the dressing room next door and was obviously feeling in one of my naughtier moods, knocked on the door and said, do you know any Gilbert and Sullivan? And blow me down, he knew the whole thing.
The command of mime and doing those big, bold things, it's really amazing. I mean, it's quite, you know, to actually put yourself out there, to sort of go,
yes,
and without it looking sort of Victorian, it's really very striking.
Works.
And there are moments of where he's sort of really animalistic. It's properly frightening.
Oh, yeah.
The girl that you love is mine already, and through her you will yet do my bidding.
I liked the glamour of Dracula films. I think there's something terribly glamorous about Dracula. And as he was played by Christopher Lee, who I'd fallen in love with when I'd been at school, and I thought he was, and still think he is, one of the finest screen faces there is. And I've tried to work it out, Mark, and I think it's this, that people who still last into the future looking darn good is their eyebrows. Gregory Peck, black eyebrows. Christopher Lee, black eyebrows, right until the very end. Right up to his 90s, black eyebrows. So I just always say that to actors. Just, well, no, just paint them on.
Mine disappear in the summer.
Suddenly draw them in.
They say that eyebrows that meet in the middle mean that you've got homicidal tendencies. So
he was always being rigged up in more heavy robes or having his eyes put in. That he carried around the book of Dracula in his pocket. He was very meticulous because he treated it, as I'm sure all the other actresses would have said, terribly seriously.
He was very serious. And he wanted us to take everything very seriously. And with a plastic bat on wires coming in and bumping into your chest and going out backwards. Impossible. You laugh. Of course you laugh. And then you hear this sonorous voice saying, "This is true." And he then started talking about Vlad the Impaler and all sorts of things that he believed were entirely historic. And we all had to behave.
It's also true about something, if you're doing farce, you have, I always remember Ray Cooney said, you have to do it seriously.
Absolutely.
Because if you don't do it seriously, it just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
No.
I had to say to Martin Jarvis, who was playing my lover in it, kiss me, kiss me.
Kiss me, my darling, kiss me.
And laughed, and so did Martin. And Christopher came marching across and heavily wagged his finger and told us off. Quite right. Smack on the wrist.
Whatever he had to do, he didn't do it camply or anything. He did it absolutely with belief, so it didn't look like overacting, which it could have looked like in some other cases. If that, does that make sense?
Yes, completely, yes.
Whilst Christopher Lee regarded Stoker's original story as sacrosanct, Hammer's producers were keen to move in a groovy new direction. At the beginning of the 70s, they produced the charmingly daft Dracula AD 1972, in which Stephanie Beacham took on the role of Van Helsing's hippie granddaughter, Jessica.
I mean, we were still saying man and, you know, yeah, and too cool.
Did you feel Christopher Lee was slightly disenchanted by this stage of doing so many Draculas?
No, I didn't feel he was at all disenchanted. I felt he was rather disenchanted by the modern setting. He grew big and quite, I mean, enormously theatrical. But it was, every inch of him was real. So that that was impressive, and he needed to be able to swish that cloak.
But for one bride, meeting Christopher Lee almost proved too much.
No, I didn't want to see him. I thought it better for me as a young actress. I'd worked in a few films before now. I just wanted the surprise of seeing him as Dracula. And boy, did I get a surprise. He suddenly came through the door, and I caught sight of him, I remember. And there's 6'4" of him, white-faced, dark, dark eyes. And he came forward, so my reactions, I think, felt, to me, totally real.
Increasingly disillusioned with how far Hammer films were straying from the source material, Christopher Lee nevertheless proved to embody Dracula for an entire generation.
Jeremy, what are you wearing? Oh, my pink.
1970's Taste the Blood of Dracula was partly filmed here, at Tykeswater Bridge in Hertfordshire. I've brought back one of its stars to ask him, how did it feel to come face to face with the Prince of Darkness himself?
I became involved and thrilled to be part of something that was already legendary in the sense there had been 2 or 3 or 4 Hammer horror Draculas, apart from all the other tradition of Dracula going back to Bela Lugosi and so on. In fact, somebody said to me afterwards, so what did you learn about working with Christopher Lee? And I'm pretty certain I replied, economy. If you look at it on the page, he doesn't have a lot to say. Every appearance is hugely telling. 6'4", with this great demeanor. I think that that's what Christa was very good at, filling up with Dracula and being ready in his cloak, ready to just watch and react. And then the camera would come round on him for his looks. He was a master actor.
Up until now, Dracula had been mostly terrorizing us from the big screen. But increasingly, he was being invited into our homes. In 1968, Denham Elliott gave an underrated performance as the Count for ITV. And in 1974, Jack Palance brought a steely menace to the role in Bram Stoker's Dracula. In 1977, the BBC made what is perhaps the most faithful adaptation of Stoker's novel. Using many locations from the book for the very first time, and with French actor Louis Jourdain in the lead role. In the summer of 1890, Bram Stoker visited the small harbour town of Whitby, here on the northeast coast of England. Before being joined by his wife Florence, he spent a week here alone, visiting the library, chatting to locals, and generally mulling his new story. This, he thought, might be the perfect place for his vampire to make landfall in England. Impressed by its striking scenery and the gaunt ruins of the Gothic Abbey, Whitby became the backdrop to many of the most memorable scenes in the novel, as the Count finally makes his appearance in the New World. The BBC's Count Dracula used the Abbey, church, and even the famous 199 steps to tremendous effect. Actor Susan Penhaligon memorably played the doomed Lucy Westenra, sleepwalking through Whitby's desolate streets for a fatal appointment with the Count. Did you feel sort of a sense of rightness about actually being here?
Yes, I think I did feel a connection. It does make the script real when you're in the actual place, there's no doubt about it.
It was very, very true to the book. What he created was the journeys of the characters. That's what was so good, particularly Mina and Lucy, and also particularly Lucy, because I did go from rather a sweet, sort of kind sister to this growling vampire.
Come to me, Quincy. Come, my love. Leave these others, and we can rest together for eternity.
This scene, as Susan faces down Frank Finley's marvellous Van Helsing, is seared into my brain like a crucifix into a vampire's flesh. Was Louis Jourdain part of the package when you were asked to do it? Did you know he was going to be Dracula?
Yes, I did know that he was going to be Dracula, and meeting him for the first time was slightly overwhelming for me.
Hollywood star Louis Jourdain was cast as the vampire Count, bringing with him a touch of the exotic, just like Bela Lugosi back in 1931.
He was quite
Hollywood, a little bit old Hollywood, a little bit starry, very French, Parisian French. So he had a kind of aloofness about him, which you can see in his Dracula.
But then, of course, I'm partial. I have a passion for the English language. I would wish to speak it faultlessly, perfectly.
But you almost do, Count.
This almost is disheartening. You shall remain here for a while so that I may learn from you and shatter this almost irrevocably.
It's kind of perfect for the part, though, isn't it, I think?
Perfect for the part. He did take it very seriously, I remember, of course, as anyone playing Dracula would.
I think he's a very, very canny piece of casting. As you look at it now, he must have been about 55. He's a very beautiful man, but his matinee idol looks are sliding. And somehow that's kind of perfect for Dracula, I think. Yes. There's something off about him. And it's just a clever idea.
This wonderfully queasy, unsettling Dracula remains one of my favorite versions to this day. Its fidelity to the story is never over-reverential, but clever and nimble. The casting of Louis Jourdain and its use of the imposing locations of the book's original setting make it one of the most memorable adaptations of Stoker's novel. Then 2 years later, in 1979, Dracula made perhaps his sexiest entrance to date.
Count Dracula. Good evening.
Starring actor Frank Langella, a new version of the old play had become an unexpected hit on Broadway, and Universal Films once again saw its cinematic potential.
Miss Van Helsing. My savior. I trust you're feeling improved.
Yes, thank you.
The great joy of this film is that that interpretation is very, very interesting. That he is an incredibly romantic figure.
Our version was originally a stage play, and Frank Langella, who played Dracula, had starred in that. And it was a different version in as much as it was far more romantic. I think horror fans of horror were quite upset that there wasn't more blood and gore and horror in it. And I was relieved that it wasn't what I would have termed a heavy hammer horror version. Frank brought an incredible sexiness. His performance was a very sensual performance. He was mesmeric to work with. I always got the feeling with Frank that his Dracula, if it hadn't been for the fact that he needed blood to survive and therefore had to kill his victims, would probably like to have fallen in love. So it was a very romantic piece. It was lush, it was gothic in style, with this central character who you had a lot of sympathy for and were very attracted to.
I need your blood. I need.
But he had a dignity about him, an innate dignity about him, and he was a very serious actor. I mean, somebody said to me he was America's leading stage actor at the time.
When he finished the film, I think he says he hangs up the cloak in his dressing room and he thinks, I must never put that on again, otherwise it will define me. I think he famously said, I spent 2 years of my life playing Dracula, and it took Hollywood 15 years to forget it. And there's an afterlife, isn't there, ironically, for Dracula.
He was probably very sensible to do that, I think.
The thing that really comes through is Frank's hair. It's so incredibly 1979.
Oh, he's so boofed.
Yes.
So boofed.
Oh my God, he's a beautiful man.
Absolutely, absolutely gorgeous. And because sometimes with some of the versions one's seen and pictures certainly I've seen, you think, well, why would these women actually bother? I think I'd have been off and not. But you just sucked in to Frank.
The 1970s had been the busiest time the Count had ever known, but he now entered one of his occasional rest periods, returning to his chilly tomb until 1992, when Gary Oldman took on the role in the sumptuous, bizarre, and somewhat inaccurately titled Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Welcome to my home. Enter freely of your own will and leave some of the happiness you bring.
Count Dracula?
I am Dracula.
Despite being the definition of a curate's egg, the Coppola Dracula still has legions of fans and casts its own very particular shadow.
Come in.
Perhaps it goes to show how robust Stoker's character is.
I think it's a fascinating film full of, visual coda cinema, if you like, and it was very much Coppola collecting together all his favorite horror imagery from the history of cinema and throwing it all at the wall and seeing what would stick, and a great deal of it does. But as a purist, I feel, the film is perfectly valid as a rather free adaptation of Dracula, but the fact that it was advertised so relentlessly, even in its title, as being absolutely faithful to the novel is, frankly, absurd.
The Count has worn many faces and is continually reinvented for a new generation, ensuring that the immortal vampire always has the last laugh.
Action.
Over 120 years after Stoker's novel was first published, production on our new Dracula series is drawing to an end.
I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker.
So what has allowed this story to live on and be retold countless times?
I am Dracula.
Cut. Lovely. Oh, right. Brilliant.
Dracula, whether this was quite his intent or not, is the first time that evil gets to be attractive and evil gets his name on the cover. And evil is, you're not supposed to be attracted to evil. You're really not. We're supposed to be repelled by evil and attracted by good. And this is a fairly straightforward statement that that is not the case. Frank Langella is clearly a very attractive man, and Louis Jourdan is famously a very handsome man. Christopher Lee, good-looking man. It's just, it's that thing. Being attracted to what you should not be attracted to.
What do you think our Dracula has brought to the role?
I think his particular gift, his particular approach, right from the very first edition to the last episode of the film, is an ability to be quite flip, quite lightweight, but make that sinister. Because he's never more frightening than when he chooses to smile and to make an offhand, slightly glib remark.
Can I not recognize her face?
Well, you do look rather drained.
You look young.
And I owe it all to you. Thanks.
I was very struck through the whole filming process that there are times that I thought I was surprised by how scary and disturbing it was when he was being at his most sort of urbane.
When he's lightweight and funny in the horrific situation, what it instantly tells you in a chilling way, he's terribly used to this. Killing someone, destroying someone utterly, isn't an unusual event for him. It's something that he's acclimatized to. And there's something deeply chilling about that. There's something very frightening about someone who is unmoved by their own evil.
If you let me live, then I
will do everything in my power to stop you.
Quite right. That's my Johnny. Welcome to the mountain tops.
Do you have a standard sort of process in terms of approaching a part, you know?
I started watching all the old movies just to sort of see what do they do and can I steal a little bit something here and there. I've never done a character that has been where there is so much material out there, so I just thought it would be great for inspiration. The one thing that I can sort of try and make something of is to have that basic need that he has. He has a basic need for food like we do, or sleep, or sex, and I actually don't sort of see him as, you know, just wanting to destroy everything. It's something that happens as a byproduct of what he does.
Johnny, this is interesting. I've never seen it work with a baby before, never. I think I might keep it on for a while. I hope this doesn't mean that I'm getting sentimental.
Did you know Dracula beforehand?
Obviously, what everybody sort of knows. Dracula is so iconic. He's got his own emoji on your phone. It's like the snowman and Santa Claus and Dracula, I think. So it's like, the weird thing is that you realise this is something that children of 3, they know this character because they dress up as him when they go for Halloween or something.
Johnny, you're like me. I am not like you.
Bram Stoker's iconic work is celebrated to this day, and once a year in his hometown of Dublin, a weekend of cultural festivities is held in his name. What is it about Dracula that still resonates?
I think Dracula is still so popular because he's an amazing character. There's absolutely no one else like him back then and still even today.
Classic, everlasting, it doesn't age. No. It's timeless.
There's just something about the aesthetic, the look, it's so creepy, but there's something human about it at the same time.
I think it's so popular because he's talking about our hidden, maybe dark side of a human being.
I think in the book he's more like a monster.
He is, yeah, he's described
when
as
we
disgusting,
put him on screen.
But people still interpret it as beautiful and suave.
From Gary Oldman that did it, from going back to Christopher Lee, they were all gorgeous.
"120 years after the Count first landed on our shores, it's clear his hold over us is as strong as ever. But why?
For me, the key lies in the Count's multiplicity of faces, worked on by a whole raft of talented people since 1897. From the novel, to the stage, to the screen, Dracula has been a medieval warrior, a feral beast, a lounge lizard, a demon lover. He's all these things and more. And by becoming mythic, he's open to endless reinvention. Dracula, evil's own hero.